The morning of the Ashcombe charity ball arrived the way all important mornings do in great houses, not with peace, but with organized chaos. Fires were being lit before dawn. The kitchen had been awake since 3. Footmen carried silver down from locked cabinets, while housemaids scrubbed floors that were already clean, because Lady Beatrice Ashcombe believed that cleanliness was something you demonstrated, rather than simply maintained. Flower arrangements arrived from the hothouse in crates, and the butler, Mr. Graves, moved through the corridors of Ashcombe Hall with the grim authority of a general preparing his troops for battle. The charity ball was the most anticipated evening in the Yorkshire social calendar. Dukes and barons, clergymen and magistrates, wives draped in silk, and husbands draped in self-importance, they all came. Every year, without fail, and every year, Lady Beatrice made absolutely certain that Ashcombe Hall looked like something out of a painting. This year, she intended the evening to be the finest yet. Eleanor Whitmore had been employed at Ashcombe Hall for 3 years. She was 22, slight in frame, with the kind of quiet competence that more experienced servants sometimes resented, and most others quietly relied upon. She did not gossip. She did not complain. When silverware went missing from the dining room 2 winters ago, it was Eleanor who found it tucked behind a loose panel in the pantry and returned it to Mr. Graves without telling a soul who had carelessly left it there. That sort of girl. That morning, she had been assigned to the Duchess's private dressing chamber, the most delicate assignment any maid could receive, and one that required, above everything, silence and discretion. The chamber itself was a monument to wealth. Heavy damask curtains in deep burgundy, a dressing table crowded with crystal perfume bottles and ivory-handled brushes, a fire burning low in the grate, and on a velvet stand beside the mirror, the Ashcombe sapphire necklace, the most recognizable piece of jewelry in the county, possibly the country. 3 large sapphires set in gold, flanked by smaller stones that caught light like still water. It had belonged to Edward's grandmother. His mother had worn it at her wedding. Lady Beatrice had worn it at hers. Eleanor dusted the mantelpiece carefully, keeping her back to the dressing table as she always did. She adjusted the fire screen, straightened the small chair beside the window, and left the room as quietly as she had entered. She did not touch the necklace. She had never once touched the necklace. 30 minutes later, the entire household stopped breathing. Lady Beatrice's voice, high and sharp, the kind of voice that could silence a room through walls, tore through the corridors of Ashcombe Hall. "Where is it? Where is it?" Then the footsteps, quick, furious, the rustle of silk moving faster than silk was meant to move. Eleanor was in the ballroom helping to arrange chairs when the doors burst open and Lady Beatrice swept in like a storm wearing a morning gown. Every servant in the room straightened. Every noble guest who had arrived early turned to look. Lady Beatrice raised one finger and pointed it directly at Eleanor Whitmore. "You're a thief!" The words landed like a slap. Eleanor turned slowly. She felt the color drain from her face, not from guilt, but from the particular terror of being accused in front of people who had already decided to believe it. "My lady, don't!" Lady Beatrice's voice dropped into something colder. "My sapphire necklace is gone. You were the only person in that chamber this morning. Everyone else was accounted for. You were seen leaving." She stepped closer. "I want it back. Now." "I don't have it, my lady. I didn't search her." 2 footmen stepped forward. Eleanor stood very still as they checked her pockets, her apron, the small cloth bag she carried her polishing cloths in. Mr.
Graves watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. The other maids looked at the floor. Nothing was found. This did not satisfy Lady Beatrice. If anything, it annoyed her.
"She has hidden it somewhere in the servants' quarters. Search those rooms too."
The humiliation was quiet and thorough. Other servants were made to stand aside while Eleanor's small room was turned over. Her Bible, her spare dress, the 2 letters from her mother she kept folded beneath her mattress, all of it examined, all of it handled by strangers while Eleanor stood in the corridor outside and fixed her gaze on the wall. The steward, a thin-lipped man named Harwick, arrived looking very official. "Under the circumstances," he began, with the particular pleasure of someone who had always found Eleanor's quiet competence slightly threatening, "I am prepared to have you escorted to the estate jail until the matter is—" "That will not be happening." The voice came from the far end of the corridor, unhurried, completely calm. Duke Edward Ashcombe was not a man who raised his voice. He was tall, perhaps 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that had the careful quality of someone who thought before he spoke, a rarer quality than people supposed, even among the educated. He had been watching from the moment his wife entered the ballroom. He had said nothing, allowing it to unfold, taking note of every detail. Now he walked forward, and the corridor rearranged itself around him. "No one," he said, "is being taken anywhere without proof." He looked at Harwick, then at Eleanor, then at his wife. "We will investigate this properly. Every person with access to those chambers will be questioned, every guest, every servant, Eleanor included." He paused. "But she will not be imprisoned on the basis of accusation alone." Lady Beatrice stared at him. "Edward, the necklace will be found." He said it with certainty. "Begin the questioning, Harwick. I will conduct it myself." He turned before anyone could reply and walked back down the corridor. Eleanor remained exactly where she stood. Around her, the house resumed its anxious noise, whispers, shuffling feet, the distant clatter of the kitchen. The ballroom doors closed softly. She was not innocent until proven guilty in anyone's eyes. She knew that. But something had just happened that she had not expected. Someone had believed her worth protecting, even before she had spoken a single word in her own defense, and that, in a household like this one, was more remarkable than the missing necklace itself. The village of Haworth sat 3 miles from Ashcombe Hall, close enough that its residents knew the estate's business before the estate sometimes knew it itself. News traveled fast in small places, carried by dairy carts and market women, and the particular efficiency of people with very little else to occupy their attention. By the time Eleanor Whitmore walked through Haworth's main street that evening, her carpet-bag in hand and her coat pulled close against the October wind, at least a dozen people already knew why she was there. She felt their eyes, a woman drawing her curtain shut, 2 men outside the blacksmith's who stopped talking as she passed, the butcher's wife, who had always been perfectly civil, suddenly found something urgent to examine in her shop window. This was how it worked, not with cruelty exactly, but with distance, the kind that settled around an accused person like frost, quiet, thorough, and very difficult to shift. Her Aunt Martha's cottage sat at the end of a narrow lane behind the church. It was small and cold, and smelled of dried herbs and tallow candles, and Eleanor had never in her life been so relieved to see it. Martha Whitmore was a stout woman in her 60s who had buried a husband, raised 3 alone, and developed as a consequence the kind of practical fearlessness that comes from having already survived the worst. She opened the door before Eleanor reached it, took one look at her niece's face, and stepped aside without a word. She put the kettle on. She didn't ask questions. After Eleanor had drunk her tea and stared at the fire for a long while, Martha simply said, "Tell me what happened." Eleanor told her everything. When she finished, Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the Duke stopped them taking you to the jail?"
He did. Martha made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Well, that's either a very good man or a very careful one. Eleanor didn't answer. She wasn't sure yet which it was. She slept poorly that night. The cottage walls were thin, and the wind came off the moor with force, rattling the window latch and pushing cold air under the door. She lay on the narrow cot in Martha's back room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the necklace. Who had taken it? How it had been done? Whether anyone was genuinely looking, or whether the investigation was simply a dignified way of letting things settle until the accusation quietly hardened into accepted truth. The following morning, needing something to do with her hands and her thoughts, Eleanor walked down to the village inn to collect a parcel Martha had been expecting from the carrier. The inn was warm and loud and smelled of pipe tobacco and stale ale. She collected the parcel from the innkeeper's boy and was pulling on her gloves to leave when she heard it. Two men seated near the hearth, merchants by the look of them, travelling coats still damp from the road. They were speaking low, but the inn's noise had a particular quality. It swallowed some conversations entirely and carried others with surprising clarity across the room. Asking about sapphires specifically, cut stones, loose ones, not interested in settings. Eleanor stopped. She did not turn around. Who was asking? Don't know him. Came through Keighley 2 nights past. Well-dressed, spoke like a gentleman, but paying in coin rather than credit. Discreet about it. A pause, the sound of a cup being set down. Jewelers around here don't deal in that sort of thing. Told him as much. He didn't seem surprised. Moved on toward York, someone said. Loose sapphires in Yorkshire. Odd timing with the business up at Ashcombe. Aye, that's what I thought. Eleanor walked out of the inn at a perfectly normal pace. Outside, she stood in the cold air and breathed carefully. A gentleman, well-dressed, asking about loose sapphires, moving toward York. She turned this over in her mind on the walk back to Martha's cottage, and by the time she reached the lane, she had already begun to understand something important. Whoever had taken the necklace had moved quickly. Too quickly for someone without a plan already in place. This was not an opportunist. It was not a servant who had seen a chance and taken it. Someone had come to Ashcombe Hall specifically, with a destination already in mind and a buyer already sought. Which meant Eleanor had not been accused carelessly. She had been accused conveniently. She sat down at Martha's kitchen table and thought about Lord Reginald Blackthorne. She had noticed him the previous morning, she noticed most things, entering the private corridor that led to the family wing at a time when no guest should reasonably have been there. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Guests sometimes wandered in great houses. It was not her place to question them. Now she thought a great deal of it. Martha came in from the garden and found her niece sitting very still with an expression she recognized from Eleanor's childhood. Focused, decided, slightly dangerous. "You're going to do something," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "Someone set me up to take the blame for this," Eleanor said quietly, "and they nearly succeeded." She looked up. "I'm not going to sit here and wait for justice to find its way to me." Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to the larder and began packing bread and cheese for the road. Duke Edward Ashcombe had not slept. This was not unusual for him during difficult circumstances, but the nature of this particular sleeplessness was different. It wasn't worry exactly. It was the persistent, uncomfortable feeling of a man who suspected he was looking at something that didn't quite fit, like a painting hung fractionally crooked on a wall. Nothing obviously wrong, just enough to keep drawing the eye. He sat in his estate office before dawn, with the household ledgers open in front of him and a candle burning low beside the inkwell. The fire had died to embers. Outside, the moor was still dark, and the wind pressed steadily against the window glass. The guest list for the charity ball was 12 names long. Most were familiar. Neighbouring families who had attended for years, a bishop from Leeds, 2 magistrates and their respective wives.
Routine, respectable, predictable. Lord Reginald Blackthorne was the exception. He had been invited at the suggestion of Lady Beatrice's cousin, who had met him at a card evening in Harrogate and described him as charming company. Edward had no strong feelings about him either way when the invitation was extended. He did now. He pulled the household entry log toward him, a record kept by Mr. Graves of every person who entered or moved through the family wing, maintained with the thoroughness that Graves applied to everything. It was not glamorous work, but it was exactly the kind of record that became invaluable in moments like this one. Lord Reginald had arrived at Ashcombe Hall at 10:30 on the morning of the ball. He had been shown to a guest room in the East Corridor, standard enough. But the entry log showed something else. At 11:15, 15 minutes after arriving and before breakfast had even been served to the guests, Lord Reginald had been noted entering the private corridor. The private corridor, which led, among other places, directly to Lady Beatrice's dressing chamber. Edward sat back in his chair and read the entry 3 times. Mr. Graves had made a small annotation beside it in his careful handwriting. Guest appeared to be seeking the library, redirected by footman Thomas. Redirected? But the question was how far he had walked before Thomas found him. And Thomas, Edward recalled, had been pulled away to assist with flower deliveries shortly after. There had been a gap of perhaps 10 minutes in which that corridor was, unusually, unattended. 10 minutes was more than sufficient. Edward closed the ledger and moved to the stables before full light had broken over the moor. The head groom, a reliable man named Silas, was already at work. "Lord Reginald's carriage," Edward said without preamble. "Yesterday morning. Was it here the entire time?" Silas rubbed the back of his neck. "Not entirely, Your Grace. His coachman took it out, said his lordship had forgotten something in the village and sent him to fetch it. Gone perhaps 40 minutes. What time?" "Just before noon, Your Grace." Edward nodded slowly. Just before noon. The necklace had been discovered missing at noon, which meant the carriage had left the grounds within minutes of, or during, the theft. Long enough to carry something away from the estate before anyone thought to stop it. He thanked Silas and walked back toward the house in the thin morning light, turning each piece over carefully. When he questioned Lord Reginald after breakfast, he did so in the drawing-room with a pleasant expression and a cup of tea. "A small matter," Edward said pleasantly. "The entry log shows you walked into the private corridor yesterday morning. My staff noted it." Lord Reginald laughed. It was a very easy, very practiced laugh. The laugh of a man who had been charming his way out of tight corners since boyhood. "Good Lord, yes. I was looking for the library, completely lost in this magnificent house of yours." "Your footman set me right," he smiled. "I do hope I haven't caused some inconvenience." "None at all," Edward said. He watched Lord Reginald's hands as he said it, perfectly still, perfectly controlled. Too controlled, perhaps, for a man who was merely embarrassed about losing his way to a library. After Lord Reginald excused himself, Edward stood at the drawing-room window and watched him cross the lawn toward the rose garden with his hands clasped behind his back. Unhurried, comfortable, the posture of a man who believed himself entirely safe. He did not know that a kitchen maid named Dora had already spoken to Mr. Graves that morning. Dora was 17 and not given to drama, which was precisely why what she said carried weight. She had been carrying linens along the servants' passage, a narrow corridor that ran parallel to the private wing, at approximately 10:15 the previous morning. Through the thin wall, she had heard footsteps in the private corridor, then a door, then silence. She had not seen a face, but she had heard the footsteps, and she described the pace of them as unhurried, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Edward instructed Graves to say nothing of this to anyone. Then he sent a quiet message to his trusted valet, Perkins, to ready 2 horses and pack for an overnight journey. There was a jeweler in York he needed to speak to. Urgently.
and he suspected, though he could not yet say why, that he would not be the only one making that journey. York in October had a particular quality to it: the smell of coal smoke and river damp, the narrow streets pressing close on either side, the old city walls rising grey against a sky that couldn't quite decide between cloud and rain. Merchants moved along Stonegate with their collars turned up. A flower seller called from beneath a dripping awning. Church bells marked the hour from somewhere behind the minster, and the sound rolled through the streets like something that had been rolling through them for centuries and intended to continue. Eleanor arrived by public stagecoach at 8:30 in the morning, stiff from the journey and cold in a way that had settled into her bones somewhere around the second hour. She had told Martha she would be back by nightfall, which she now suspected was optimistic. She carried a small purse, her warmest shawl, and the name of a street she had extracted carefully from a second conversation at the Harworth Inn. A different merchant, a different morning, but the same thread pulling in the same direction. Gillygate. That was where the jewelers were. She found the street without much difficulty and walked its length slowly, reading the signs above the shop doors. Most were goldsmiths dealing in new work: rings, brooches, watch chains. She was looking for something older, a dealer in antique pieces, in estate jewelry, in the kind of work that came to a shop without clear papers of provenance. She found it near the end of the street. A narrow shop front, the sign faded. H. Mossop, Antiquarian Jewels and Estate Pieces. The window displayed a modest collection: brooches, a few rings, a pocket watch on a velvet stand, nothing showy. Exactly the kind of place a man might visit if he wanted a quiet transaction with a minimum of witnesses. A small bell announced her entrance. The shop was dim inside, smelling of beeswax and old velvet. Glass cases ran along both walls, and behind the counter stood a man of perhaps 70. Small, neatly dressed, with the careful eyes of someone who spent his life examining things closely and had learned to be equally careful about what he said. He looked at Eleanor. Then he looked at the door behind her. "I'm alone," she said. He relaxed slightly. Only slightly.
She explained herself simply. She was a servant, recently accused of stealing a sapphire necklace she had not stolen, and she had reason to believe someone had attempted to sell stones matching that necklace in York within the past 2 days. She did not perform distress. She simply stated the facts in the same quiet, direct way she stated everything, and watched his face carefully while she did. Mr. Mossop was silent for a long moment. "A gentleman came in," he said finally. 2 days past. Well dressed. He had 4 loose sapphires. Good quality, very good quality, the kind you see in old family pieces." He paused. "He wanted a private valuation, no paperwork." "Did he give a name?" "He did not, and I didn't ask. At the time, I thought—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "I told him I couldn't assist with unpapered stones. He left." "Could you describe him?" Before he could answer, the shop door opened. Duke Edward Ashcombe walked in, followed closely by his valet Perkins, and stopped when he saw Eleanor standing at the counter. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. "Miss Whitmore," the Duke said. "Your Grace," Eleanor replied. Neither of them commented on the extraordinary coincidence of being in the same jeweler's shop in York, because both of them immediately understood that it was not a coincidence at all. They had simply followed the same thread from different ends. Edward turned to the jeweler and introduced himself by name. He watched Mr. Mossop's expression shift. The careful neutrality of a man in trade meeting a duke was a specific and readable thing. "I believe you were about to describe someone," Edward said, pulling up a chair for Eleanor with a natural ease that surprised her. He remained standing himself. Mr. Mossop described the man. Tall, well-dressed, dark coat, gloves, spoke with the assured manner of someone accustomed to being accommodated, did not remove his hat, came in the afternoon, left within 10 minutes when Mossop refused the transaction. Lord Reginald Blackthorne, down to the hat. Then Mossop hesitated. He looked at the window, then at the door, then at his own hands on the counter. "There's something else," he said quietly. "I made an inquiry afterward, spoke to another dealer on this street about the stones, described them. Word travels among us." He swallowed. "Yesterday morning, 2 men came to my shop. They didn't want to buy anything. They told me to keep quiet about any visitors I'd recently had. One of them put his hand on my counter like this." He placed his own hand flat on the glass, "and looked at me for a very long time without saying anything else." The shop was very quiet. "They came back an hour later," Mossop added, almost to himself. "Just walked past slowly, looked in through the window." Eleanor felt the shift in the room, the point where a missing necklace stopped being a household matter and became something with sharper edges. She looked at the Duke. He was already looking at her. Outside, the church bells marked the half-hour. Somewhere on Gillygate, unhurried footsteps passed along the wet cobblestones and did not stop. They left York separately. It was the Duke's suggestion, made quietly outside Mossop's shop while Perkins waited with the horses. If Lord Reginald had men watching the jeweller's street, and the slow pass of those footsteps outside the window suggested he very likely did, then the Duke and Eleanor leaving together would confirm that the investigation had reached York, and Lord Reginald would move faster than they could follow. Edward would return to Ashcombe Hall by the main road and give every appearance of a man who had learned nothing useful. Eleanor would travel back through Keighley on the afternoon stagecoach. That was the plan. Eleanor kept to it for approximately 4 hours. The stagecoach stopped in the village of Burstwith to change horses, and it was there that she saw him, one of Lord Reginald's servants, a heavy-set man she recognized from the morning of the ball, when he had brought his master's travelling case into the hall. He was on horseback, moving at a deliberate pace along the lane that branched away from the main road and out toward the open moorland. He was not travelling toward Ashcombe. He was not travelling toward any village she knew. He was heading onto the moor at dusk, which no sensible person did for innocent reasons. Eleanor got off the stagecoach. She told herself this was foolish even as she did it. She pulled her shawl tighter, waited until the coach had rolled on, and followed at a distance that kept her far enough behind to avoid notice and close enough to keep him in sight. The lane narrowed quickly into a track, the ground turning soft underfoot, heather pressing in on either side. The sky above the moor was the particular shade of dark grey that preceded a Yorkshire night, not quite black, just colourless and heavy, the light leaving without drama. She walked for perhaps a mile before she saw the building. It sat in a shallow depression below a ridge, low and long, its stone walls the same colour as the moor around it. An abandoned hunting lodge. She had heard of such places, but never seen one this far from the estate. 2 horses were tied outside. Dim light showed through a gap in one of the shuttered windows. Eleanor crouched behind a stand of gorse and watched. The heavy-set servant dismounted and tied his horse beside the others. He knocked twice on the door, a short pattern, and was let inside. Through the gap in the shutter she could see movement, the shadow of at least 2 figures moving around something laid out on a table. She could not make out what it was from this distance, but the careful, deliberate way the figures moved around it reminded her of something. It reminded her of work. Detailed, focused work. She needed to get closer. The sensible part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive and employed for 22 years, had quite a lot to say about this. She ignored it and moved forward, keeping low, using the gorse for cover, testing each step before committing her weight. The ground was soft enough to muffle footfall. The wind was in her favor, carrying sound away from the lodge. She reached the wall. Through the gap in the shutter, she saw a table covered in dark cloth. On the cloth, laid out in rows with the neat precision of a workman who took pride in his trade, were sapphires. Loose stones,
some still in their settings, some already separated. Tools beside them, small pliers, a jeweler's loop, a cloth for handling. One of the men was working by lamplight, with the focused patience of someone who had done this before. The other stood near the door with his arms folded. The Ashcombe necklace was being taken apart, stone by stone. Eleanor stepped back from the wall. One step, then another, turning carefully. Her foot found a loose stone beneath the heather and sent it skittering against the lodge wall with a sound that was, in the silence of the moor, approximately as loud as a gunshot. The door opened. She ran. There was no dignity in it, and she didn't attempt any. She simply ran, back up the slope toward the track, her boots sinking into soft ground with every stride. She heard shouting behind her, then footsteps, more than one set, gaining faster than she could manage on the uneven ground. They caught her at the top of the ridge. 2 men, neither of them gentle. They pulled her back down the slope toward the lodge, and she fought every step of it, which achieved very little except buying perhaps 30 extra seconds and costing her both her shawl and a considerable amount of composure. The sound of hooves came from the eastern track without warning. A horse cresting the ridge, moving fast, a figure low over the neck, and then Duke Edward Ashcombe, who had apparently not returned to Ashcombe Hall by the main road either, pulling up hard and taking in the scene in a single glance. What followed was brief and not particularly elegant. Edward was on horseback and the 2 men were on foot, which settled the mathematics of the situation fairly quickly. In the confusion, Eleanor pulled free, and as they made for the track, she snatched something from the table through the open lodge door. 1 sapphire, loose, cold, unmistakably the deep blue of the Ashcombe family stone. They rode hard for 20 minutes before either of them spoke. "You didn't go back to Ashcombe," Eleanor said. "Neither did you," said the Duke. London arrived the way it always did for people travelling from the north, gradually at first, then all at once. The coaching roads grew busier, the villages closer together, the air thicker with coal smoke and the particular smell of a city that never quite stopped moving. By the time the carriage crossed into Mayfair, the Yorkshire moor felt like something from a different world entirely. Edward had arranged separate lodgings. His own townhouse on Grosvenor Square was the obvious base, and Eleanor was installed quietly in a respectable boarding house on a nearby street, the kind that asked no questions of guests who paid in advance and kept reasonable hours. Perkins handled the arrangements with his usual discretion. The investigation had shifted in character. On the moor, it had been physical, raw, immediate, driven by instinct and luck. In London, it required something different. Patience, precision, the ability to move through rooms without disturbing anything. Edward spent the first morning at his solicitor's chambers on Fleet Street. The solicitor, a careful man named Aldworth, who had handled the Ashcombe family's legal affairs for 30 years, listened without expression while Edward laid out what he knew. When Edward finished, Aldworth was quiet for a moment, then opened a drawer and produced a thin leather folder. "Lord Reginald Blackthorne," he said, "has been of some professional interest to my colleagues for the better part of 2 years." He placed the folder on the desk between them. 3 creditors in the city, 2 more in Edinburgh, gambling debts primarily, though there are some questions around a land sale in Shropshire that did not bear particularly close examination. He paused. He is not the first man of his rank to find himself in this position, but he is perhaps unusual in the lengths he appears willing to go to address it. Edward read through the papers carefully. The debts were substantial, the kind that pressed on a man daily, that followed him into drawing rooms and card games and made every social engagement a performance of solvency he could no longer afford. Creditors were growing impatient. One had engaged a debt collector the previous month. Lord Reginald needed money quickly and quietly, and the Ashcombe necklace,
broken into individual stones that could be sold separately across different cities, was precisely the kind of solution a desperate man with access to country house parties might devise. Edward thanked Aldworth and left with the folder tucked under his arm. Meanwhile, Eleanor had risen before 6. She had spent the previous evening asking careful questions of the boarding house cook, a sociable woman who knew the domestic staff of half the street, and had established that Lord Reginald's Mayfair townhouse was currently understaffed, his housekeeper having recently dismissed a kitchen girl under disputed circumstances. There was a small agency 2 streets away that placed temporary domestic staff for households in exactly this kind of situation.
By 8 o'clock, Eleanor was dressed in plain dark wool, her hair pinned severely, and presenting herself at the agency as a reliable kitchen maid available for immediate placement. By 10 o'clock, she was inside Lord Reginald's townhouse. It was a handsome house that had been allowed to become slightly shabby in the way that suggested money once present and no longer quite sufficient. The carpets were good but worn, the silver needed attention. The remaining staff, a butler of advanced years, 2 footmen and a cook, moved through their work with the subdued manner of people who had not been paid on time recently. Eleanor kept her head down and her ears open. She worked in the kitchen through the morning, efficient and unremarkable. At midday, the butler took his meal in his pantry, and the footman disappeared to the servants' hall, and she found herself briefly alone in the corridor outside the butler's pantry. Through the door, she heard the footmen talking. They were not being particularly discreet. Men rarely were when they believed themselves unobserved, and domestic servants in difficult households had a tendency to air grievances among themselves with considerable frankness. "Parcels in the master's dressing room," one said, "wrapped in oilskin. I moved them when I was laying the fire, and he near took my head off." "What sort of parcels?" "Don't know. Heavy for their size. He's had them moved twice in 3 days." A pause. "And there's a man coming Thursday to collect. Foreign fellow, I think. French, or thereabouts. The master spoke to him in the hall yesterday, and sent us all out of earshot." Thursday, 2 days away. Eleanor returned to the kitchen and continued her work. She stayed through the afternoon, careful, unhurried, building the complete picture in her mind. At 3:30, she was sent to collect coals from the yard and used the opportunity to commit the layout of the house to memory: the dressing room location, the back staircase, the door that connected to the mews where a fast carriage could be loaded without observation from the street. Lord Reginald was not simply selling stolen jewels. He was shipping them out of England entirely. She was nearly at the yard door when a footman coming in from the mews stopped and looked at her. His expression shifted. Recognition. He had been at Ashcombe Hall the morning of the ball. Eleanor walked out of the yard at a normal pace, turned the corner, and did not stop walking for 4 streets. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe had always believed that certainty was a virtue. In her experience, the world rewarded decisive people, those who hesitated, who qualified their opinions, who softened their convictions with doubt. They were the ones who got overruled in drawing rooms and overlooked at dinner tables. Beatrice had learned young that a woman in her position needed to be absolutely sure of herself at all times, or she would find others being absolutely sure on her behalf. This philosophy had served her reasonably well for 40 years. It was serving her very poorly now. She sat in the estate chapel on the morning of the 7th day, which was not something she did habitually. The chapel was small and plain, stone floor, whitewashed walls, 8 pews that the household staff used for Sunday observances. She preferred the grander parish church in the village for her own devotions, but the parish church required a carriage and a bonnet, and the performance of being the Duchess in public, and this morning she could not manage any of those things. She sat in the front pew and looked at the plain wooden cross above the altar, and thought about Eleanor Whitmore. The evidence had been shifting for days, and she had been watching it shift, with the particular discomfort of a woman who had built her certainty on ground that was quietly giving way beneath her feet. Her husband had said almost nothing to her directly. Edward rarely confronted. He simply placed information in her path and allowed her to reach her own conclusions at her own speed, which she had always found maddening and was finding considerably more so now. What she knew: no stolen jewelry had been found in Eleanor's possession or her room. The girl had returned voluntarily to help with the investigation rather than disappearing, which was not the behavior of someone with something to conceal. A kitchen maid had seen a guest in the private corridor, and Eleanor's sapphire, the recovered stone from the moor, had been confirmed by Ashcombe's own jeweler as matching the family necklace exactly. What Beatrice could not escape: she had pointed her finger in a room full of people within minutes of discovering the necklace missing. She had not paused. She had not considered alternatives. She had simply looked for the nearest person who could not argue back and pointed. The chapel door opened. Mrs. Hartley, the senior housekeeper, came in quietly and sat 2 pews behind without being asked to. Beatrice did not turn around. "You've come to speak to me about Eleanor?" "No, Your Grace," Mrs. Hartley said. "You've come to speak to me." It was a remarkable thing to say to a duchess. It was also entirely accurate. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "How long has she been with us?" 3 years, Your Grace, since she was 19. "And in 3 years, never a complaint against her, never a missing item she was responsible for?" Mrs. Hartley's voice was measured, not accusing. She was far too experienced for accusation. 2 winters ago, there was a matter with some silverware. She found it and returned it without naming who had been careless with it. Most girls would have used that to their advantage. Eleanor didn't. "No, Your Grace." Beatrice pressed her fingers together in her lap. Outside, the wind moved through the estate gardens, and the chapel windows trembled faintly in their frames. "The other servants," she said. "How are they?" Mrs. Hartley paused in a way that was itself an answer. "Unsettled, Your Grace. The household is fond of her. Several of the younger maids have been quite distressed." Another pause. "Thomas the footman hasn't spoken more than necessary since it happened. He and Miss Whitmore have been friends since she arrived." Beatrice stood. She walked to the chapel window and looked out at the garden. Bare now, the rose bushes cut back for winter, the gravel paths wet from overnight rain. It looked stripped and exposed, as gardens always did in autumn. Honest, in a way that summer gardens never quite were. She had been so certain, and her certainty had stripped a young woman of her reputation in front of an audience specifically assembled to judge exactly that kind of thing. In a county where reputation was the only currency a servant actually possessed. She turned from the window. "Is there anything that can be done for her in the meantime, practically speaking?" "Her position here should be confirmed, Your Grace. The uncertainty is, it hangs over the household. I cannot confirm it until the matter is formally resolved." She said it more quietly than she intended. The investigation is progressing." Mrs. Hartley stood to leave and then stopped. "Your Grace, she came back, you know, when she didn't have to, when most people in her position would have gone and not returned." She smoothed her apron with both hands. "That tells you something about a person." She left Beatrice alone in the chapel. For a long time the Duchess stood very still by the window. Pride was a strange thing. It protected you right up until the moment it didn't, and then it simply made everything worse. She had been wrong. She had been wrong in the most public, most damaging way possible, and all her certainty had accomplished was harm. Outside, a rider was coming hard up the estate drive. Even from this distance, Beatrice could see it was one of the Duke's men, riding with the posture of someone carrying urgent news. Lord Reginald was moving, and Edward was already racing for the coast. The road to Hull was 70 miles of hard riding and worse weather. Edward had left London the previous evening, the moment Eleanor's intelligence about the foreign buyer reached him. She had sent word through Perkins in a brief, precise note that contained no unnecessary detail and everything necessary. Thursday, French contact.
Shipment via the Mews. He had read it once, folded it, and begun moving. Perkins rode ahead to coordinate with the local constabulary through contacts Edward had spent 20 years cultivating across the county. Magistrates, sheriffs, men who owed the Ashcombe family professional courtesies and were willing to act on a duke's word without requiring a week of formal correspondence first. 2 constables met them at the crossroads outside Selby. 3 more joined at the toll gate north of Howden. Eleanor was in the carriage with Edward. This had been a practical decision rather than a sentimental one, or at least that was how Edward framed it. She had been inside Lord Reginald's townhouse. She knew the layout of the crates, the oilskin wrapping, the specific details that would distinguish genuine evidence from circumstantial inference when they stood before a magistrate. Perkins rode alongside. The constables flanked them. They did not speak much during the journey. The carriage moved fast over roads that became progressively rougher as they pushed northeast, the wheels finding every rut and stone in the dark. Eleanor sat with her hands folded and watched the black countryside move past the window. At some point, around the 3rd hour, Edward said, "When this is over." Eleanor looked at him. "You should know," he continued, choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything, "that what you did, returning to the estate, following that servant onto the moor, going into that townhouse, none of it was expected of you. It went considerably beyond what anyone had the right to ask." "Nobody asked," Eleanor said. "No." He looked out the opposite window. "That was rather the point I was making." Hull reached them before dawn, the estuary smell of it arriving before the city itself, salt and timber, and the particular cold that came off open water. The port was already stirring, as ports always were at that hour, men moving along the quayside with lanterns, the dark shapes of vessels shifting gently on their moorings. Perkins had established through the London intelligence that a merchant vessel called the Reliant was scheduled to depart with the morning tide. Its declared cargo was imported textiles, Bolton cotton returning to the continent after processing, according to the paperwork. Unremarkable. The kind of manifest that inspectors glanced at and set aside. They found the Reliant at the eastern quay. The constables moved with considerably more efficiency than Eleanor had expected. She had a vague notion that official proceedings involved more deliberation and considerably more paperwork. But a duke on a quayside before dawn, with documented evidence of theft and a recovered gemstone, had a clarifying effect on the pace of things. The crates were in the hold. 6 of them, stacked beneath actual bolts of cotton that had been placed on top with the obvious intention of providing exactly 1 layer of legitimacy. The oilskin parcels inside matched Eleanor's description precisely. Heavy for their size, wrapped tight, sealed with wax. When the first parcel was opened in the presence of 2 constables, the ship's master, and a harbor magistrate who had been roused from his bed and was not particularly gracious about it, the contents confirmed everything. The Ashcombe necklace, or what remained of it, lay in pieces on the quayside cobblestones in the gray pre-dawn light.
Most of the stones had already been separated from their settings. The gold framework was bent where tools had worked at it. But 3 of the larger sapphires were still intact in their original mountings, and the recovered stone from the moor matched the empty setting beside them with the kind of precision that required no expert to confirm. There were other pieces too. Jewelry from other families, other houses, other accusations that had perhaps settled on other innocent servants in other counties. The scale of it was larger than Edward had anticipated, and he stood looking at the collection on the cold cobblestones for a long moment before he said anything. Lord Reginald Blackthorne was found in a private cabin aboard the Reliant. He was dressed for travel, his luggage already stowed,
a glass of brandy in his hand that he was still holding when the constables opened the cabin door. He looked at Edward for a long moment with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on something that was almost relief, the particular relief of a man who has been running for a very long time and has finally, on some level, stopped. He did not resist. He stood, set down the brandy, and allowed himself to be escorted from the vessel with the mechanical compliance of someone who has already accepted the mathematics of the situation. At the magistrate's hearing that afternoon, the evidence presented itself with the clean, damning simplicity of truth well documented. Financial records from Aldworth's investigation, witness testimony from Mossop the jeweler, delivered in writing and confirmed by constables, Dora, the kitchen maid's account of footsteps in the private corridor, the recovered sapphire, the crates, the oilskin parcels, and Eleanor Whitmore, sitting straight-backed in a hard chair before the magistrate, giving her account in the same quiet, direct voice she used for everything, describing each event in precise sequence without embellishment or drama. The magistrate formally declared her innocent before the hearing had reached its second hour. She walked out of the magistrate's court into the Hull afternoon, gray sky, salt wind, the distant sound of the estuary, and stood on the steps for a moment, simply breathing. Edward came to stand beside her. He did not say anything immediately, which she had come to understand was his way when something mattered. "It's over," she said. "The worst of it," he agreed. Above the port, gulls turned in slow circles against the colorless sky, and somewhere behind them, in that cold stone building, Lord Reginald Blackthorne sat in a locked room and waited for consequences that had been, for rather too long, waiting for him. The postponed charity ball was announced for the following Saturday. Invitations went out again. The same names, the same guest list, the same carefully worded card in the same copperplate hand. To anyone receiving it, the ball appeared simply delayed by circumstance. The more perceptive recipients, and there were several, understood that something had happened at Ashcombe Hall that required a public conclusion as much as a private one. Yorkshire society noticed everything and forgot nothing. Whatever was going to be set right needed to be set right in front of witnesses. Eleanor spent the intervening days at Martha's cottage in Haworth. She mended clothes, helped with the garden, walked the moorland paths in the thin autumn light, and thought about very little deliberately, which was itself a kind of recovery. Martha asked her no questions and offered no opinions, except once on the Thursday evening when she looked at her niece across the kitchen table and said simply, "You held yourself well." Eleanor had nodded and looked at her tea and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and Martha understood that. On Friday morning, a letter arrived from Ashcombe Hall. It was written in Edward's hand, careful, unadorned, the handwriting of a man who had been educated expensively and used that education practically rather than ornamentally. It informed her that her position at Ashcombe Hall was formally reinstated. It noted that her presence at the ball the following evening was requested, not as a member of the serving staff, but as a guest of the Duke. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it under her Bible beside the 2 letters from her mother, which was where she kept things that mattered. Martha, who had been pretending to be occupied with the fire, said without turning around, "You'll need a decent dress." By some small miracle, Martha's neighbor, a dressmaker's widow with excellent taste and a generous nature, had a gown she had made for herself 2 winters ago and never worn, dark blue silk that had been waiting in a chest for an occasion that hadn't arrived. It fit Eleanor with minor adjustments that Martha made herself that evening, her reading spectacles on the end of her nose, her mouth full of pins, entirely in her element. Eleanor arrived at Ashcombe Hall the following evening in a borrowed carriage that Edward had quietly arranged, because he had anticipated that she would not ask for one, and he had learned by now that anticipating what Eleanor would not ask for was a more useful exercise than waiting. The hall was lit from every window. Carriages lined the drive. Inside, the grand ballroom had been arranged with the full magnificence that Lady Beatrice applied to these occasions. Candles in every sconce, flower arrangements reaching nearly to the ceiling, the orchestra already playing something stately in the gallery above. The same room where Eleanor had stood 3 weeks ago, with strangers' hands in her pockets and a duchess's finger pointed at her face. She stood at the entrance for only a moment before Mr. Graves appeared at her elbow, correct, composed, and with something in his expression that, on a less restrained man, might have been called warmth, and escorted her inside. The assembled guests noticed. They were aristocrats and clergymen and magistrates, people trained from childhood to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing, and Eleanor's entrance in blue silk on the arm of the Ashcombe butler was not the kind of thing that passed unremarked. Lady Beatrice was standing near the fireplace when Eleanor entered. She was dressed in ivory and gold, her hair arranged with characteristic precision, every aspect of her appearance managed and controlled. She watched Eleanor cross the room, and something moved across her face that she did not attempt to conceal. Edward stood nearby. He said nothing, but positioned himself in a way that made clear he intended to observe what happened next. Lady Beatrice walked forward. The room did not fall silent exactly, but it adjusted. Conversations lowered, attention shifted, the particular awareness that something significant was occurring moving through the assembled guests like a current. She stopped in front of Eleanor. "I accused you," she said, "without evidence and without fairness, before people whose opinion of you will last the length of their lives." Her voice was steady and clear, pitched for the room rather than for privacy, because she understood as well as anyone present that what had been done publicly required a public answer. "I allowed my own certainty to substitute for proof, and a person of genuine integrity suffered for it." She paused. "I am sorry, Miss Whitmore, unreservedly." The room was very quiet. Eleanor held her gaze. "Thank you, my lady," she said, simply, without performance. Lady Beatrice reached up and unfastened the restored sapphire necklace from her own throat, reassembled by the Ashcombe family jeweler from every recovered stone, complete once more, and held it for a moment in both hands. Then she fastened it back around her own neck, and the gesture carried what words might have overcomplicated. The necklace was home. The matter was closed. Edward stepped forward then and addressed the room with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. He spoke briefly about Eleanor's courage, her honesty, her conduct throughout an ordeal she had done nothing to deserve. He announced her appointment as housekeeper's assistant, a position that came with its own rooms, a salary increase, and the kind of institutional standing that made future accusations considerably more difficult to make. The orchestra, after a moment's pause, began to play something warmer. Conversations resumed. Glasses were raised. The ballroom filled again with the sound of an evening proceeding as evenings at Ashcombe Hall were meant to proceed, with music and candlelight and the particular contentment of people who have witnessed something genuine in a setting usually reserved for performance. Eleanor stood near the tall windows that looked out over the dark garden and the moor beyond, and a footman brought her a glass of ratafia she hadn't asked for, and Thomas, who had not spoken more than necessary for 3 weeks, appeared beside her and said gruffly that it was good to have her back, and she said it was good to be back, and meant it entirely. Somewhere in a locked room in Hull, Lord Reginald Blackthorne awaited trial for theft, fraud, and conspiracy against the Crown. And in the grand ballroom of Ashcombe Hall, beneath chandeliers that threw warm light across silk and gold and the faces of people who would remember this evening for the rest of their lives, Eleanor Whitmore, once accused, never broken, stood exactly where she deserved to stand. At last.